All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 12 of our course on brain and behavior. Congratulations, we've made it to the final week of the class. That means that we just have chapter 15 that we'll be going through, and then finally exam 3, which will be coming up at the end of the week and the start of the next week. So continue to persevere through these last little bit, and thank you for all of your hard work thus far. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 15. This chapter is all about how does the brain actually think. And in this chapter, we're going to be going over the nature of thought. We'll be talking about cognition and the association cortex. We'll also be going over the expanding frontiers of cognitive neuroscience, this really exciting field that's just the amount of research is overwhelming and amazing. We'll be talking about the cerebral asymmetry in thinking, the variations in cognitive organization, the concept of intelligence, and the concept of consciousness. So let's go ahead and jump into the nature of thought. Now, this is a lot about the psychological constructs. Psychological constructs, these are ideas that result from a set of impressions. They're mental processes such as thought, language, memory, emotion, and motivation. But these constructs are really difficult to localize in the brain. That is to say, there's not a specific brain region that is the region of language or the region of thought, the region of memory. It's not exactly like that. It's these distributed processes throughout the cortex, which is just showing the higher order nature of these constructs as well. Then another important term is going to be cognition, which is the act or process of knowing or coming to know. For behavioral neuroscientists, cognition usually entails the ability to pay attention to stimuli, to identify the stimuli, and to plan meaningful responses to them. So these are two key terms that I think are worth making sure that we're well aware of in this chapter. Now, with human thought, it's important to think about the relationship of language with thought. I think the idea of thought itself is one of the more thought-provoking questions that exists today. We talk a lot about thoughts and having thoughts, but what are we actually talking about when we're saying that? What does that mean? Are we referring to memories? Are we referring to something else? And the benefit, and sometimes detriment for humans is the fact that we have a language. Language gives humans the ability to think in this advantageous way where it provides the brain with a way to categorize information. A language provides a means of organizing time so that we can think about the stimulus of the auditory stimulus of Monday, the word Monday, hearing that at 3 p.m. And we're able to provide like semantic meaning to that auditory stimuli that don't necessarily need to be there, which is just utterly unique. Or if I gave you another example and I held up a little like basketball and I said, this ball, it says woo. There's no reason why the ball would say woo, but I'm telling you that it does. I asked you later on, what sound does the ball make? You would say woo. Exactly. So it's just this way in which we're able to associate different stimuli and information in these really unique ways that other animals just are not able to do, which can help us out a lot. Now, language also has syntax, so it has these sets of rules for putting words together to form meaningful utterances, and it's proposed to be a unique characteristic of human language. Unlike other animals, even very intelligent animals like dolphins, for example, they have these unique clicks and squeal sounds they end up making. The the nature of those utterances are not the same as the sense of following the same rule structure that human language has with its syntax. And this really has allowed humans to have a language that moves beyond the concrete world of here and now to give us things like concepts of time, where we're able to imagine a world in the future beyond now and a world in the past uh, that had already happened before now. Now, like I said, this is a double-edged sword. So this allows us to plan in advance to learn from our mistakes, but it also allows us to imagine all of the what ifs. So what if I didn't break up with this person? What if I got this main role in the musical instead of a more ancillary role? And that can be difficult for a lot of us. That can cause some pain, those what ifs and imagining the could have beens. Similarly, we can think about the future and we can plan ahead for what's to come, but we can also become overcome with worry. What's going to be going on with the climate? Do I think that I'm going to be able to provide for my family? And we can get caught up into the past as well there rather than staying here and now. So if you're interested in more about that, there's actually this whole therapy approach called acceptance and commitment therapy that really relies heavily on language in understanding uh, things like anxiety and depression. And I'd encourage you to look more into that. But I think it's really interesting and it's important for us to understand the function of language in human thought. Now, humans also have a predisposition to sequence movements. And this may have been encouraged by language development. A critical characteristic of the human motor sequencing is the ability to form novel sequences with ease. We're able to pick up on some of those sequences very quickly. So if I again ask you what sound does that ball make, you probably say woo. I've only taught you that the one time, but you're able to pick up and make that association just really, really quickly. In that kind of sequence, in the presence of that ball, it makes the sound woo. People who have frontal lobe damage, they often have difficulty generating novel solutions to problems. That's because the frontal lobe is really critical for organizing not only behavior, but also thinking and kind of gathering and collecting our thoughts. So if we're thinking about some of the neural units of thought, there's the cell assembly. This is a hypothetical group of neurons that becomes functionally connected via common sensory inputs. This idea or concept was proposed by Donald Hebb as the basis of perception, memory, and thought. It suggests a way of converging the inputs of individual neurons to arrive at a consensus. So we are able to see we have this group of neurons, and in information A, there is this certain set that becomes functionally connected, and in the presence of information B, there's this other unique set that becomes functionally connected, which is just interesting. The connections among neurons are not random, but they're organized into systems and subsystems. So the thought is that thinking must result from the activity of these complex neural circuits, and then neuronal ensemble then represents a sensory event that is then detected by the ensemble's activity. Now, there's been some computer modeling that's drawn upon this idea, and cognitive neuroscientists, they've demonstrated the capacity of the cell assembly circuits to perform some sophisticated statistical computations. Just kind of neat. Newsom and colleagues, they had found that the neuronal ensemble represents a sensory event, such as an apparent motion, that the activity of the ensemble then detects. The cell assemblies provide the basis of cognition, where these different ensembles come together, a lot like words and language, to then produce coherent thoughts. So one word by itself, pigeon, pigeon in and of itself, uh, actually that's probably not a good example because pigeon has some meaning, but if I use the word the instead, if I give you just the word the, that's not really leading you much as far as coherent thought or anything to draw from that. But if I said, I saw the pigeon in the park today, well, then you're able to draw some useful information and actual coherent meaning from the string of words rather than the one by itself. Similarly, these cell assemblies, any one by itself may not actually provide a very clear picture of what is the experience the individual has, but it's the combination of the cell and some assemblies together then come together to end up producing this experience. Now, the cell assemblies, they may be distributed over fairly large regions of the brain or confined to smaller areas, such as cortical columns. How do individual neurons mediate cognitive activity? Well, again, Newsom and colleagues, they had done some work on this. They trained monkeys on an apparent motion paradigm, and they made single cell recordings. They found that perception of apparent motion was influenced by individual neurons, not by the summed activity of many neurons. And the activity of individual cortical neurons is correlated with perception rather than perception being a property of a particular brain region. So here we have a figure kind of showing this kind of experiment where the monkeys were trained to identify apparent motion in a set of moving dots on a TV screen. So there was this random dot movement where there was no apparent motion perceived. Then it was the semi-random dot movement where there's still no apparent motions perceived. In the semi-coordinated dot movement, the threshold level needed to perceive apparent motion was then met. And then there was the coordinated dot movement where the apparent motion was strongly perceived. And after the monkeys were trained in this task, the investigators recorded from single neurons in the visual area, V5, which contains these cells that are sensitive to motions in a preferred direction. And the neural responses to the 4 different patterns of movement are then shown below, where in these random and semi-random movements, it really has this baseline response. As we begin to meet the threshold level, there starts to become a moderate response. And in the presence of the coordinated movement, there is a strong response there. Now, on the one hand, if our perception of apparent motion results from the summed activity of many dozens or even thousands of neurons, little correlation would exist between the activity of any one neuron and the perception the person has. Now, on the other hand, if individual neurons influence our perception of apparent motion, then a strong correlation would exist between the activity of the single cell and the perception. Now, the sensitivity of individual neurons is very similar to the perceptual sensitivity of the monkeys to apparent motion. And if individual neurons failed to respond to the stimulus, then the monkey behaved as if they did not perceive any apparent motion. All right, now that is the end of part 1 of our lecture. We're going to jump straight into part 2 now. So this is going to be about the cognition and the association cortex. The association cortex is the neocortex outside of the primary sensory and motor cortices. It really produces cognition. That's one of the key differences between the association cortex and the primary sensory and motor cortices is the pattern of connections. So it receives more highly processed information than information received by the primary cortices, and it contains knowledge either about our external or internal world or about movements. This here is a figure that shows the lateral view of the left hemisphere and the medial view of the right hemisphere. It's showing the primary motor and sensory areas, and all remaining cortical areas are collectively referred to as the association cortex, which, like I said, functions in thinking. There are these temporal association regions that tend to produce cognition related to visual and auditory processing. The parietal cortex is closely related to the somatosensation and movement control, and the frontal cortex coordinates information from the parietal and temporal association regions with information from some cortical regions. In this figure, we have a lateral view of the brain's left hemisphere in figure A and a medial view of the right hemisphere in figure B, which represents the regions of the prefrontal cortex in relationship with the associated anterior cingulate allocortex that's then shown in figure B there on the right. As far as knowledge about objects, so knowledge about objects is represented in the temporal association cortex. The brain's seeing is more compartmentalized than our perceptions. And So if the temporal association cortex is destroyed, then a person will become agnostic. Compartmentalization is revealed in people with damage to various regions of the occipital cortex, many of whom lose one particular aspect of visual perception, which is part of what makes vision kind of unique in its compartmentalization. The dorsal visual stream, it mediates vision for action, whereas the ventral stream, it mediates vision for object recognition. The knowledge about objects encompasses even more than how they look and what they're used for, and it also includes what will be done with that information. Now comes one of the big questions that's left in kind of the philosophy of mind, this multisensory integration, or the binding problem. This is really a philosophical question. It's focused on how does the brain tie the single and varied sensory and motor events into a single unified perception or behavior. Another way of saying that is like right now, I'm sitting in the basement on the couch recording this lecture. There's the visual stimulus that's coming at me of the couch and the TV. There's the auditory sensation of my voice and the fan that's in the room. There's the tactile sensation of my hands on the computer, of my body on the couch. There's the olfactory sensation. I mean, not much. There's not much that I can smell. There's not much that I can taste, no gustatory sensation. So with all the information that is being received, all of the sensory stimulation that's coming into my brain right now, my brain is taking all of that simultaneously, basically like combining it together into a single coherent experience of what is happening right now in this moment. It's almost like one of those collage pictures where it's a lot of individual photos if you look super close in, but then you zoom out and it's the bigger grand photo that ties it all together. It's a similar sense here where the question is how does our brain take all of these separate pieces of information and change it into the single, what's called the phenomenological experience of what's happening right now. Now, there is one solution that's proposed. It's that the regions of the association cortex are multimodal, and these neurons respond to information from more than one sensory modality. But overall, the binding problem, it remains one of the largest problems to be understood, I think, today. Now, if we're talking about those multisensory areas in a monkey cortex, for example, in this figure, we have these color-coded areas which represent regions where anatomical data and electrical stimulation demonstrate multisensory interactions. There's this dashed lines, and these represent the multimodal areas, which are revealed when the sulci are opened. You can see some of those like here, over there. Now, spatial cognition, that's knowledge about the environment that allows us to determine where we and objects in our environment are, how to go from one place to another, how to interpret our spatial world, and how to communicate about space. Space, both external and mental, can be related to the body. We see that in figure A. The locations of objects, they can be represented in egocentric and allocentric spatial reference frames, which is shown in figure B over there, the difference between the allocentric, the relationship between objects to each other, and the egocentric of the relation of objects to you or to the person. Also, the same figure can be oriented differently in space, which is seen in figure C, where we have the same figure, like I said, just oriented in different directions. The ability to mentally manipulate visual objects likely develops in parallel with our ability to navigate in space. Cognitive abilities evolved to support the guidance systems for controlling movements, and the increased capacity for building and manipulating objects played heavily into developing our cognitive spatial abilities. Once the brain can manipulate objects that are physically present, it seems like a small step to manipulating imagined objects. The ability to mentally manipulate visual images likely arises in parallel with our ability to navigate in space. So really the evolution of mental manipulation and as a skill is closely tied to the evolution of physical movements. As far as deficits of spatial behavior go, a patient with right posterior parietal lesions, they show a variety of spatial deficits such as topographic disorientation and egocentric disorientation. Deficits in spatial behavior are also seen after damage to the posterior cingulate cortex and medial temporal regions, such as Ballant syndrome. In the selection attention task, selective narrowing or focusing of awareness to part of the sensory environment or to a class of stimuli, and it can be directed inward or outward. Now, James Moran and Robert Desmond, they done some research which showed that neurons in areas V4 could be trained to respond selectively to information in their receptive field. After training, neurons responded only when a visual stimulus was in the reward location. The neurons would not respond when the same stimulus was presented in a no reward location. This finding suggests that attending to specific parts of the sensory world is a property of single neurons, and there's more evidence that the neuron is the computational unit of cognition. Now, each animal in this study that was conducted by these researchers was trained to attend to a stimuli presented in one particular area of the visual field and to ignore stimuli in any other area. The same visual stimulus could be presented to different regions of the neuron's receptive field to then test whether the cell's response varied with the stimulus location. As far as deficits of attention go, there's can be this frontal association cortex, and people with frontal lobe injuries, they tend to be overly focused on environmental stimuli. They also seem to be, they seem to direct attention to an excessive degree selectively or to have difficulty shifting attention. As far as parietal association cortex goes, damage there can produce this contralateral neglect. Contralateral neglect, that's really ignoring a part of the body or world on the side opposite or contralateral to that of the brain injury. So neglect of a particularly, or rather, neglect is particularly severe in right hemisphere damage. So what this could look like is you have a patient who walks into your office and you notice that the gentleman, as he sits down, um, he's smiling and everything, but on the right half of his face, he's cleanly shaved. On the left half of his face, he has a bit of a beard. And you ask him, "Oh, sir, like, I noticed you have a bit of a beard." And he goes, "Oh, no, I don't. I shaved this morning." And even though it's clearly evident, objectively, that no, this person does have a beard on half of his face. And that's because um, that truly it's not that his eyes are not working. This patient would be able to see that fact. It's that he's not attending to that half of space, not attending to the world on that half of things. So one of the compensatory strategies for patients like that is they'll essentially just look all over. Their eyes will be moving around a lot to make sure that any information that is over on the contralateral side is able to get brought in. There's also extinction. Pardon me. In neurology, the neglect of information on one side of the body when presented simultaneously with information on the other side of the body. So patients with contralateral neglect, they exhibit the symptom as they begin to recover. In people who have it, they again fail to pay attention to one side of the physical world around them and one side of the physical world represented in their minds. Testing for extinction. So a person who shows neglect for information presented to his left visual field responds differently depending whether the objects are in the left and right visual fields are similar or different. So in this figure here, we have this patient um, who is shown two identical objects. Uh, these objects are, again, both in the patient's right visual field and in his left visual field. The patient sees only the objects in his right visual field, even though both of those are presented to him. So in this case, if you ask the patient, well, what am I holding up in front of you? He would say, oh, you're holding a coin. And he'd be correct. You have coins in both hands. Now, what happens if you show the patient two different objects, a coin and a key, let's say? The patient sees the object in both visual fields. So we'd be able to recognize that if we're able to see them in both fields. Now, when the patient is shown two kinds of an object, the patient only sees the object in his right visual field. Which again, I think is just, it's a really interesting condition, the neglect and understanding it. The damage of the parietal association cortex described here, it differs from the loss of proprioception following damage to the neurons that carry sensory information to the cortex. And I think that it is just a really interesting area of study in the pathology of the brain. Planning and executive function. So to plan, there we go. A person needs to recognize objects, an occipital and temporal lobe function to make appropriate movements, which is then a parietal lobe function. In this case, the frontal lobes are acting like an orchestra conductor. The frontal lobes make and read a motor plan to organize behavior in space and time, a kind of score analogous to the musical score a conductor uses. People with frontal lobe injuries are unable to organize their behavior. So, for individuals who may have damage to the frontal lobes, their performance on the Wisconsin card sorting test exemplifies the deficits in frontal lobe injury causes. The Wisconsin card sorting test, it's a neuropsychological measure of planning and abstract reasoning. And it requires this shifting response strategy, which is particularly difficult for people with frontal lobe lesions. The pattern of behavior known as perseveration tends to repeat the same verbal or motor responses to varied stimuli. So maybe an example of this is if you're doing something like a copycat type game, and you're saying, okay, do what I do, and you tap your hand against your thigh like I am right now, and you have the other person do that with you in synchronous. Okay. You're starting to do it, and then you change to hitting your thigh and then clapping your hand. So you go. With that change, individuals who have some of the frontal lobe damage, they're perseverating. So even though the rule has changed, where now you're going to beat where you hit your thigh, beat where you clap your hands, they continue just to continue tapping their thigh, would be an example of some of that perseveration. And so that's some of what gets pulled out in something like the Wisconsin card sorting test, where it requires some planning and abstract reasoning and the ability to shift based on incoming information. And it can just be really helpful to demonstrate the deficits that frontal lobe injury causes. It's one that I've used with patients a fair amount now in the hospital, and it's really interesting because for some people, they don't really have any difficulty there. It's where essentially the participant or the patient, they receive a deck of cards, contains multiple copies of those represented here, and it's presented with rows of 4 cards selected among them. Task is to essentially place the card in the pile to the appropriate card in the row, sorting by one of a few possible categories. But the patient is never explicitly told the correct way in which they're supposed to sort the card. And instead, they're only told whether their response was correct or incorrect. And so it's essentially this like learning experience for the patient trial by trial where they're able to try to determine or problem solve, well, what is the correct response, and to use some of that planning and reasoning skills to understand, well, what is the rule that I need to follow to continue to get these correct responses. The caveat is, though, after the subject or patient started to like figure out what the rule is to get the correct answer, all of a sudden the tester is going to unexpectedly change the rules of the game, basically, so that what was previously the correct answer no longer is, and it's a different rule that's being applied without that being explicitly told to the patient. So once we change the rule, the game's changed. Is the person, as they like recognize this, able to change their responses accordingly? And there are a lot of patients who I've seen who you end up changing the rule and they continue to play based on the rule that they had figured out before, essentially continue to play the old game. And I keep telling them, no, that's not correct, incorrect, incorrect. And they get really frustrated, as you might imagine, because you're thinking, well, this used to be right. This was right. This was what the rule was. But they're not able to apply then any kind of shifting in the task. Next, we're going to be talking about imitation understanding. For successful communication, the sender and the receiver need a common understanding of what counts. There are these things called mirror neurons, and these are cells in the primate premotor cortex which fire when an individual observes a specific action taken by another individual. Rizzolatti is the human capacity to communicate with words, which may have resulted from the evolution of the mirror neuron system. Many movement neurons in the inferior frontal and posterior parietal cortex discharge when a monkey sees another monkey or experimenters make the same movements. The mirror neurons could provide the link between the sender and the receiver of a communication. It's used both for imitating others' actions and for understanding their meanings. So originally mirror neurons were hypothesized to be the basis of understanding actions rather than merely recognizing them. This possibility had profound implications, and it led to the proposition that mirror neurons form the basis of speech and language, empathy, social cognition, and theory of mind, all kinds of really, really big stuff. But data accumulated from many brain mapping methods, including fMRI, PET imaging, transcranial magnetic stimulation, uh, magnetoencephalography, and neuronal recordings, they've revealed really the complexity of mirror neurons. Recent data accumulated from these methods show that the strength of neuronal responses in the MNS is modulated by multiple factors involving actions, actor, observer, the relationship between the actor and observer, and the context. The brain understands actions and facilitates making movements quickly and more accurately. And currently, MNS is being applied to rehabilitation interventions. One researcher, it was Kemmerer, concluded that none is yet able to account for the full complexity of the system. However, the studies of the MNS demonstrate that the brain understands actions and facilitates making movements quickly and accurately. So here's a figure showing some of the mirror neuron system or the MNS. The core mirror neuron system is shown in yellow. It's sensitive to the transitive movements. It comprises of the inferior frontal cortex, the ventral premotor cortex, and the inferior parietal cortex. The distributed mirror neuron system in humans, it responds to hand movements. That's going to be in the purple shading, in the dorsal premotor cortex, and the superior parietal lobe. Upper limb movements, which are shown in blue, in a portion of the superior temporal sulcus, and tool use, which is shown in orange, and the intransitive movements in which no object is manipulated is shown in green. This was work by Cattaneo and Rizzolatti in 2009. And that is the end of part 2 of our lectures for this week. So make sure you tune on in for part 3 coming soon.